identify streams of life. We can identify streams of life, and in identifying those streams, we can look for others. In botany, we all know what a monocotyledon is. A monocotyledon. We see them in grasses. The grasses, the monocotyledons. We see them in bamboo. We see them in cereals. And we rightly sense that they have a different kind of evolutionary stream from the dicotyledons. The dicotyledons. The great representative of the dicotyledons is, of course, the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And the flowering plants have gorgeous, round, integrating structures, which we know so well, roses and so on. And again, we rightly suspect that there is a difference in the evolutionary stream of these. It probably doesn't surprise you, therefore, to find that the flowering plants, including the angiosperms, the flowering plants are on a stream that stretches from the most primitive mosses clinging to the rocks without any roots, to ferns which never flower, to flowering plants which only began flowering about 90 million years ago on the planet, when the planet underwent an initiation and the plant kingdom flowered into perfection in great numbers. Shrubs, trees, yes, we can see links there beautifully. But when we come to the monocotyledons, we find a completely different kind of shape altogether. And here we think of the grasses, we think of the cereals like barley and oats and wheat with their whiskers, like I've tried to draw at the top there, which are highly evolved grasses. The cereals are highly evolved grasses. It is said that the Namanicayas had a great deal of influence, and they are Venusians, that this Venusian influence, and by that we mean they came from the second globe of the fifth round of our own scheme. They had an influence on the grasses to produce cereals, and when we look at the way in which cereal form takes its shape, it's then not very difficult for us to see how the lobsters and the other crustacea began to elaborate as a succeeding form for the life in the grasses. And this stream, again, still very different from our own one. The plants, called the angiosperms, becoming shrubs and trees, they in their turn producing the huge antediluvian reptiles, which were massive. They represented the highest expression of the animal kingdom in the third round on the earth. The third kingdom, the animal kingdom, in the third round, it was their day. It was their day. Great brontosauri and the various plated reptiles of that day. And then another stream splitting here into the lower mammals. Finally, the mammals themselves, some of which were taken and domesticated, again using Venusian fire as it is channeled through man's brain, and man is the finest domesticator of animals in the solar system. And so the higher kingdom, the fourth kingdom of man, raised and still has to raise all these. That's part of man's work, is to raise these lower kingdoms, these kingdoms of animals and plants and so on. And even the mineral kingdom to be raised. Look how we've raised the mineral kingdom. You ever think about it? Look what we've done to the carbon element. We've taken carbon, we have used it as graphite, subjected it to extraordinary experiences as graphite, and more extraordinary experiences as the diamond, so valued, so that diamonds like the Hope diamond and others become vortices of energy, emotional energy, which produce occult factors that affect the lives of individuals who possess the diamond. It's a good example of the influence which man has on mineral things. But look what we've done to carbon. We've incorporated it into over 700,000 compounds of carbon. 700,000 compounds. Just about most of our kitchen utensils today are made up of carbon combinations, the polystyrenes and all the plastics that we know about are all opportunities for carbon to be subjected to unusual experience, not just locked away in the bowels of the earth, having no experience environmental change at all, but greatly changed by what we do with the carbon material. Package things in it, eat things out of it, wash them up, and so on. Tremendous opportunities there. And then the flowering kingdom, and people who come into incarnation especially to do this, like Luther Burbank, who takes plants and alters them and fosters them and nurtures them. And look at our English gardens. It's the thing that we spend more money on than anything. We're absolutely weak and impotent when it comes to our gardens. We can't afford it, but we spend money on them. And we nurture these plants and make borders with them, bring them together in unusual groupings, array them in certain ways, and again, tremendous influences on them, and they have a tremendous influence on us. So that people like doctors, who are basically second-rate soul types, caught up in their work, worn out, automatically rush to gardening, and so on, many other groups. So there are many things to be seen here with regard to nature. Now, look how the grasses are trained, influenced to become cereals, how the fungi are related later to bacteria, which of course are much more virulent, much more human, rather much more human in association, insects and reptiles, and then birds. Insects, reptiles, and birds. Almost follows a Darwinian thing here. The reptiles becoming birds, we know, Darwinian proposition, but a separate stream, you see. And so we say that bees, with their great capacity for helping mankind, are also part of this stream. And it is said that bees themselves were greatly influenced by the Namanicayas, But we can see they're quite a distinct form from this evolutionary life over here. Birds, not very far from the structure or morphology of bees. Very, very similar. Now, these, of course, we are able to observe. All this represents all these forms here, the seaweeds that become sponges, sponges that become corals, corals that become cephalopods like squids, and then fishes. How often haven't I pointed out to you that many of the creatures that we see from the great depths of the oceans are really anomalies. We see these extraordinarily etheric-like forms in the lower oceans with lights and all sorts of apparitional materials making up their forms. And we know that the great depths of the sea have created such pressure that etheric life that shouldn't have physical bodies at all normally can have them at that great depth. And they are really etheric forms of life, though they have accreted physical forms. Now, we must remember from our earlier studies that the earth has got an etheric body, that long before the earth actually formed, long before it formed, there was an etheric part to the planet. There was an etheric part to the planet, interpenetrating it, of course, and we call it the anima mundi of the planet. But according to Besant, at the time of about 100 million years ago, the northern regions of this etheric part of our planet were very, very highly populated with all kinds of plant life, animal life, human life. It was the Garden of Eden. It was the Garden of Eden. And man existed there, divine man existed there in his etheric form. And it was out of this Garden of Eden that he precipitated his physical body and then walked on the earth and couldn't get back to the Garden of Eden. He was cast out forever. Well, many of the forms in the etheric world briefly flash into existence in physical bodies as part of their descending arc. You have the descending arc in which forms get grosser and denser, and then they get lighter and lighter and go into another cycle. And so the hidden life of many of these creatures, like insects and reptiles and salamanders and structures like that, are mainly in the etheric world. They have form there, a form there, a form there, and then a physical form briefly, and then an etheric form again. And that's their cycle, the descending arc and the ascending arc, into denser form, out of denser form. And so we quite frequently see strange grasshopper-like structures, and, which represent only the dense physical form of a series of 7 in which 6 are etheric. And what we're really saying then is that just as these bees and ants and insects and so on, seaweeds and corals and fancy-looking fishes, are so different from our mammals and our trees and our flowering plants, we say that go a little stage further. Say, go beyond this frontier here. Go beyond this frontier, and you have, roughly like this, you see, roughly like this frontier going down here, and you're into the world of nature spirits. You're into the world of nature spirits. And many of these nature spirits exist entirely in etheric form. They exist entirely in etheric form, but under certain circumstances, they can be coaxed. They can be coaxed to materialize. They can be coaxed to materialize temporarily for a few minutes, for a few hours, or they can be seen by people who are beginning to develop etheric vision. The same people who see UFOs sincerely and honestly, who are seeing into the etheric, but could also, under different circumstances, look into the natural worlds. And they can, under such circumstances, like Geoffrey Hodgson, who wrote The Kingdom of the Gods, and Leadbeater and others, observe these etheric forms here, and indeed, in certain regions, it is possible for these etheric forms to draw physical ectoplasm from humans, and for themselves to materialize, And because they draw the ectoplasm from humans, especially humans in natural circumstances, in isolated natural regions of England and other places, they very frequently are able to create forms which are human-like. They are able to form gross structures like gnomes and goblins according to the land that they live in, according to the height of the land that they live in, and there can be distinct changes between valley nature spirits and mountainside nature spirits. And there is then a very thin veil that lies between us and the world of nature spirits. Many of them copy the flame-like structures of fire. The salamanders and other similar organisms are said to be on the line of fire devas. Now, when we realize that our own methods of thinking incorporate the use of some of these nature, not nature spirits, but nature elementals, we can see how important this is. When we fashion thought into shape, mental substance wrought into form, we are dealing with essences from these planes. And by essences we mean materials of those planes which are not necessarily living things, but will form anything that is demanded of them. Now we can have a look at our sheet more meaningfully. We can look at our sheet more meaningfully. And starting right at the bottom, we can see that there is elemental life. Elemental life, and quite frequently elemental life is within rocks and within the soil, but not actually ensoling the rock or the soil. Leadbeater pointed out that beneath the level of the earth there are innumerable elementals there who have an existence of their own and cannot live on top of the earth. But because we think that below the earth nothing can grow, it doesn't mean to say that there aren't hierarchies of life there, or indeed that under certain conditions these hierarchies of life may express themselves above the earth or be called up by certain so-called magical rites. So we see mineral life showing itself on the one hand as water and on the other hand as earth. And just as water is different from earth, so we have whole hierarchies of life above water there as being distinct in shape compared to life that evolves from earth form or through earth form. We begin to understand that there are innumerable hierarchies of life using our planet, that no human tissue can be shaped or formed without the presence of these deva entities, which takes us into the field of healing and makes us understand that if ever we want to regenerate nerve tissue, that we must learn how to attract appropriate elementals who construct nerve tissue. The body merely assembles the material together. The etheric matrix provides just that, a matrix for it. But it is the tiny devas who fashion the human form and repair the human form. And if we have healing hands, we create a medium in which these devas attracted, as they very frequently are attracted to certain individuals, attracted to them will cooperate with them and will undertake work which is normal for them. And so when we talk about the forming of a healing group, I tremble. I think about it very carefully, and I say to myself, we are neither temperamentally suited for it yet, apart from the ability just to set up a clinic. We're not really suited yet to create an appropriate healing center. Now, if we could acquire the woods behind my home, if we could erect there a healing center in the middle of them, where no cars or lorries or people could intrude, where they could be encouraged, then we might see true healing occur. But then there are many ways of healing. A lady came to me the other night and said, "What shall I do about the cataracts that I've got in my eyes? Shall I have them operated?" and so on. Many of us should understand that you cannot replace what is surgically missing by healing. Medically, we can provide services. A medical condition usually will respond to healing. But if there's a surgical condition, you've got to think very carefully before you encourage the person. And all sorts of things need to be considered. Later on, when we use magnetic fields gently, when we have a healing center, when we have ectoplasm on tap, it may be possible to join fragmented bone together. But at the present circumstances, it's not being done anywhere. So there are many applications to this extraordinary field. Now, I'm going to go on to another somewhat different subject, and Mark is going to be taking up the subject of the nature spirits in different forms very slowly with you later on this afternoon. Are there any questions about what we've really just looked at briefly this afternoon? Well, now I want to introduce you to some new material on the application of fire knowledge. The application of fire knowledge. We all know, of course, that the flame of an acetylene welding instrument can cut through steel. We all know what lasers are beginning to do, what we've been beginning to show that lasers can do. And with fire, we link the concept of fire with mind. The fires of mind. And we know that to manage fire, you have to have strong control. An acetylene flame that will cut through steel is well controlled, and precautions are taken to deal with it, so that the eyes are screened, shielded, and so on. We talk about fiery endeavour. And we're beginning to learn that with certain practices, all the sporting records are going to be broken. They're not only being broken at the moment, but it's forecast that they're going to be broken by considerable margins of record time in the future. And we're wondering how this can be done. Surely it can't be just done on feeding the person or by giving hormones. There must be spiritual implications. And there certainly are spiritual implications. You see, the plane of Atma shown in green, the plane of Atma shown in green, best expresses itself through the plane shown in violet, the physical. The Atma best expresses itself through the plane shown in violet. And Atma is divine persistent will. And it is fiery will. And the sportsman who from the earliest age learns to concentrate his effort into the right parts produces the best performance. A sportsman who can concentrate his effort into the correct parts of himself produces the best effort. When Cassius or Muhammad Ali or whatever he calls himself is training for boxing, he's not training haphazardly. The boxer must be fit, and he is training and exercising the particular muscles which he's going to use, and the whole of the training is calculated to bring the maximum effort into the punch. And really, training is a form of bringing down the fires of the Atmic plane into the physical body. so that effort can be sustained. Having said that, we must shift our attention to a higher level and say that we know that fire is a manifestation of the spiritual, and that it is the phenomenon predominantly of the real in the subjective world. Therefore, we should apply the same principles of fire, which are being wrought in sportsmanship, into our own private spiritual practices. And indeed, this is true. Now, I haven't gone into this matter from the point of view of analyzing it and finding contemporary examples of it, but I thought I would just pass it on to you. We could say this, that success in spiritual endeavor depends on. Success in spiritual endeavor depends on. Firstly, the raising of the spiritual tone of the environment. The raising of the spiritual tone of the environment. The sportsman does his best performance in an environment which is encouraging to him. We all know that the football team that plays on the home ground has a better chance. The bookmakers will give them better odds. We all know that the boxer keeps his entourage around him, not just his managers and so on, but he has a whole gymnasium that moves around with him. The ring is set up in that way. We all know in drama that the play is an absolute in a ghastly state in rehearsal, but that the full dress performance, the full dress rehearsal, rather, is very important indeed. And that pulls the whole thing together. Hamlet struggling on his stage with to be or not to be, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and so on, is not greatly helped with furniture men moving the scenery around him and the orchestra tuning up its instruments and the lights flicking on and off as they practice this and that. But when you put him in to the full dress rehearsal, and you put him in his full dress, and you put him onto the stage with the scenery in its correct position, and with his opposite number properly dressed, out comes the performance. And all your worries about the individual are lost because you have created around him the right environment. In meditation, we call this a room of one's own, a room of one's own. And whilst I have seen extraordinary individuals sit and apparently meditate in a crowded room of hubbub, there's no doubt about it in my mind, from years of experience with spiritual people, or people with spiritual endeavor, that each one of them in the end learns to value his little room of his own. Doesn't matter if it's only the corner of a stable somewhere where he can just draw the curtains and it's his room. Terribly important. Because it's the place where he does his thing, his spiritual work. And when that can be enlarged to include a group, so that you are living in an ashram in which all those in the ashram are fully dedicated, fully committed, all having the same spiritual motives, in the sense of it being one overwhelming phalanx ready to assault the halls of ignorance, the armies of ignorance. It's a great help to be part of an army, part of we call it in other senses a camaraderie. There's a camaraderie. So let me just say those words again. Firstly, success in spiritual endeavor depends on the raising of the spiritual tone of the environment. And if you have a controlled environment where people are not, as it were, half involved in spiritual matters, who recognize that it's absolutely fundamental that you have 3 or 4 early nights a week. I'm a voice crying in a wilderness.